Okay, let's get this thing started. We're going to have some fun tonight. This is the LaRouche Pack class series. We're starting kind of a two-part for the next 2 weeks with special guest Susan Kokinda. You know her from many of the Monday calls. But Susan has done extensive work in the area of the very, what's the best way to put this? The fight that defines Western civilization. It's not Republican versus Democrat. It's not red versus blue, but it is little r Republican versus oligarchical. And there are fundamental different conceptions that deal with those two political outlooks. And the base of that, of course, is ancient Greeks and ancient Athens. So Susan's going to take us into this into that world for, I think, a profound examination of how do we think about our society today. Now, one of the reasons this is so important is because, as it's been said by others, and we certainly agree, and would say that we have to refound our nation today. You have to reestablish in spirit, not in just words, not merely in nominally say we're for the Constitution, but in spirit, in the minds of the American people, a sense of where this nation as a constitutional republic came from, as an idea, as a process, and is founded on principle, and make those principles come back to life. And I think that's really the challenge. We're finding, I think, an increasing response from the ferment of the MAGA Trump movement, of the duplicity and fraud of the election. And you're seeing a new coalition that violates the left versus right, blue versus red construct, a construct that basically tries to trap people into choosing which way they want to go down, versus actually looking to how we raise the nation up. And you're seeing increasingly, because that's what principles do. Principles are by nature something that grow, that develop. And you're starting to see a coalition politically around principle. And our sense is that we have to make this a self-conscious historical identity. It's not something that just manifests itself in today's culture. It's something that defines the very advancement of civilization itself. Now, let's just put this in context, because I'm sure Socrates, Plato, and other Greeks would have great appreciation for what they see taking place in American politics today. And they would say, well, I think I know what you guys are experiencing. They're seeing the so-called democracy movements, the BLIMs, as I call them, BLMs, or other radical democracies, attacks on the Supreme Court. For many in the ancient Greek world, the attacks on their Areopagus, their Supreme Court, were common from the democratic mobs and other aspects of things. So you see these kinds of fights within factions. But what the leading thinkers understood, and what certainly Socrates and Plato could very much distill after a couple of hundred years under kind of an established Athens, was something different. Well, that's what's happening in the world today, in our country today, to bring these ideas alive. What Biden's collective, the Paflakis and others around Biden, who announced this week that, oh yeah, I mean, Donald Trump just last week launched a lawsuit against the big tech firms for specifically colluding with the government and becoming an arm of the government, specifically the Democratic Party, but really the government, the intelligence agencies, the executive, the administration, the bureaucracy, an arm of them to basically violate our constitutional rights of free speech and free expression. That they're basically they're contracting out what they themselves as government can't do. Paflaki, the press spokesman for the Biden collective, said this week, oh, we're telling Facebook what sites to censor. They basically came out and admitted it. This is brazen overreach. Partly it's because since the Hunter Biden story was slammed and shut down 2 weeks before the election, these people have gone absolutely insane. They know there's no way you can put that genie back in the bottle. They're admitting to it. But not only did they say that we are working with Facebook to shut down certain sites, that if any person is banned on any site, you had a leading kind of COVID watcher, Alex Berenson, who was kicked off Twitter. This is happening to people all the time at this point. But if any one site kicks you off, Pawlacki said, kick them, you should be kicked off all sites. And not only that, that AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile should watch your text messages. And if your text message is violated, you should at least get notices about how your text message is disinformation. This is beyond Orwell. You can see the kind of panic, the idea that they have to control the discussion and deliberation. But what too many Americans may be unconscious of is that the real question is what we as an organization, as a philosophical faction in this political fight within this country have represented, reawakening that creative quality, the access of the mind to understand and act upon these principles that have shaped the country, not just to resist this insanity, but to reestablish those principles. And that's what they're really trying to shut down. And because they can't control the mind, they can't prevent us from doing that. They can prevent us maybe from sharing things on Facebook. They can't stop this. And that's why the human mind is the most important part of this political fight. So I'm going to leave my comments there because Susan has a whole world to bring us into. So Susan, why don't you kick us off and see where we go?
All right. Thanks, Mike. Well, I'm actually going to start out by quoting another great philosopher, namely Yogi Berra, who said it's deja vu all over again, because it actually is the case that it's Republicans versus Democrats, but in a different sense, perhaps, than most of you on this call are thinking about. So I want to start right out with a quote from Lyndon LaRouche. So Mike, if you could put the first slide up. Okay. This is from a piece Lyndon LaRouche wrote in 1978, where he talked about creating a Republican Labor Party. It's a very, very prescient piece because it in many ways touches on the political revolution taking place in the United States now, as the Trump movement and others are breaking free of the established parties and creating something quite literally new. But what Mr. LaRouche said in this is really the theme for tonight's discussion. He said, the Republican Party is thousands of years old. It is traced in terms of formal historical knowledge available to us today in the writings of Plato and Plato's Academy at Athens, and Alexander the Great's city building policies. Republic, he says a little bit later, is defined most efficiently by emphasizing the direct opposition between Republican and democratic forms of organization of society, as this issue was defined by Plato and has been defined in all rigorous treatments of the matter, both in our nations, by our nation's founding fathers and down to the present day. Now, today's Republican Party in its current form is not the Republican Party that Mr. LaRouche is referring to here, the 2,500-year-long party. The institutions created by our founding fathers were in that tradition. Lincoln's Republican Party was in that tradition. The seed crystal of something emerging around the Trump movement, and again, the others who have broken free from traditional parties, is in that tradition. The Democratic Party, on the other hand, is absolutely the Democratic Party of the Democratic Party of Athens, which executed Socrates. As Mike said, the same kind of mob mentality. What we have to do is we have to recover, in a sense, the continuity of that 2,500-year-old Republican Party, and bring that back to life into the fight. So Mike, if you could put the second one up, the second slide. This is another piece that Mr. LaRouche wrote in 1978, a famous piece entitled, actually a book-like piece entitled Secrets Known Only to the Inner Elite. And this is available, if you Google it, it's available for purchase in various kinds of venues. But here he talks about, in a sense, the irony of the fact that today's Democratic Party is the Democratic Party of 2,500 years ago, but our Republican Party is not. And what he says in this piece is, through 3 millennia of recorded history to date, centered around the Mediterranean, the civilized world has been run by 2 bitterly opposed elites. The one associated with the faction of Socrates and Plato, the other with the faction of Aristotle. During these thousands of years, until the developments of approximately 1784 through 1818 in Europe, both factions' inner elite maintained in some fashion an unbroken continuity of organization and knowledge through all of the political catastrophes which afflicted each of them in various times and locales. It was the elite associated with the Platonic or Neoplatonic faction which organized the American Revolution and established the United States as a democratic constitutional republic. But in the aftermath of the Treaty of Vienna, the shattering of the power of the Platonic elite in Europe meant in large measure both a scattering of the main forces of that faction and an associated increasing loss of the secret knowledge through which the Platonic inner elite had formerly developed and exercised its factional power. So this rather extensive document, in which Mr. LaRouche goes through the history of ideas throughout several thousand years. I mean, he's playing with the idea of secret knowledge because it's not secret, it's just suppressed. The oligarchical elite, the imperial elite, they know what happens when people and nations have at their power the principles and the ideas which allow them to self-govern and which allow them to develop. And those ideas have to be suppressed. And there has been, for 2,500 years, nonstop battle to either suppress or distort the ideas of Plato and the Platonic tradition. Because if people are armed with these ideas, we will defeat empire and we will defeat oligarchy. Now, what I want to do tonight, Mike, you can take it down. What I want to do tonight is try and bring Plato and his fight alive, not only in the context of his dialogues, but in the actual political battles which he, number one, grew up with, and number two, then engaged in all of his life, especially after the execution of his political mentor, Socrates, in 399. We will see that Plato's Academy is anything but academic. I really wonder how that word got turned into what it is today. Because the academy that Plato created in the years after Socrates' execution was anything but that. It was created to do political, military, and intellectual combat against the oligarchy of the time. And that oligarchy was the Persian Empire. So Mike, if you could put up number 3. I just want to give you a map, just so you have a sense of the size of the Persian Empire. This is in 490 BC. This is before Socrates, this is before Plato. But, you know, what was known as the known world was absolutely dominated by this huge imperial, brutal, evil empire. But in the first decades of the 5th century BC, i.e. in the 490s and the 480s, something amazing happened. Greece, which is very small on this map, on the left-hand side, you can hardly even see Athens and Sparta. You can see Macedon and Thessaly there. But various of the Greek city-states repulsed the Persians twice as they tried to invade Greece. one at the famous Battle of Marathon, and in 490 and in there's a naval battle, and there was a naval battle at Salamis, and there was a land battle, not Marathon, there was a land battle in which they defeated the Persians, which was shocking, absolutely shocking. Now, this was a result of the fact that Greek civilization had been influenced in the previous decades and centuries by influences such as Egyptian civilization, the Pythagoreans who were in Italy, various scientific breakthroughs, philosophical statecraft breakthroughs, and people we know of like Heraclitus and so on. I'm not going to be able to go through the background, the prehistory to what caused Athens to emerge, but it was a rich, rigorous civilization which was grappling with the fundamental questions of how do you know the universe, how do you act on it, how do you effectively act on it, and so on. But the world that Socrates and Plato, two different generations, come into is the world of the post world after the Persians had been repulsed. Mike, can you put the next one up? This is the world of both Socrates, who was born in 469 BC, and the world of Plato, who was born about 40 years later. You see in the middle is Greece itself. This is a representation of the sides in the Peloponnesian War, which we'll come to in a minute. The Athenian side is red, the Spartan side is blue. Take particular note, though, over to the left of the screen of Italy and Sicily. There are a lot of Greek colonies. In fact, you can see the gray is neutral Greek colonies over there. The Greeks had already colonized this area, and this is going to become very important as we move on to Plato's life. Look, the Peloponnesian War. Well, let me back up a second. The Persians had been repulsed by the Greeks. They watched the Greek city-states beginning to develop in terms of their political outlook, in terms of their military power, in terms of their economic development, their scientific developments. They were not going to sit there. The Persians were not going to sit there and let that happen. So what did they do? They did exactly what we've been subjected to for the past 30 years, perpetual war, get everybody fighting everybody else. And this is what the Peloponnesian War was all about. The Athenians had become susceptible to this kind of manipulation because they were increasingly tending toward an imperial outlook of their own, heavily influenced and manipulated by the agents of the Persians. The Spartans had their own outlook, so it was very easy to pit these two sides against each other. Now, the Peloponnesian War went on for almost 30 years, and it was a horror story. But this is the world that Plato is born into. And what I want to do is first show you a timeline. Mike, if you could put the next one up. This is a timeline of some of the most important events right before and during Plato's lifetime. And what I've done on the right-hand side is I want you to see how old Plato was when these things were happening, because he is born into and lives his life in a time of absolutely incredible political turmoil, social chaos, and military horrors. So I put the birth of Socrates at the very top, 469 BC. And then we get to the period of the Peloponnesian War, which starts in 432. The leader of the Athenians, the so-called great Pericles, had increasingly become, had imperial tendencies. which made Athens and their counterparts in Sparta so susceptible to being manipulated, kind of like the George Bush and Barack Obama administrations were, as they dragged us into perpetual wars over the recent decades. Pericles himself died of the plague because one of his strategies when Athens was under siege by the Spartans was to pull everybody inside the city walls, to stock up enough food, to have everybody inside. And of course, you can only imagine what happens when you've got many more people inside the city than should be. Diseases broke out, the plague broke out, and that was the end of Pericles. So this is the world that Plato was born into. He was born in 427. I'm just going to show a couple of other critical dates, and we're going to come back to these dates when we look at Plato's dialogues. But these are some of the seminal points in the unfolding tragedy of Athens and, frankly, the other Greek city-states as well. There was a peace between the warring parties established in 421. It was called the Peace of Nicias. Nicias is a figure we will meet in Plato's dialogues. Plato was 6 years old. It would have been, if that peace had stuck, then Plato would have grown up in a very, very different world, but it didn't. By 416, the war was back in full swing. And another figure whom we're going to meet in many of Plato's dialogues was a military and political leader named Alcibiades, someone whom had been very close to Socrates as a young man. Socrates had fought mightily to train Alcibiades' mind so that he could be the kind of leader that a society would need. He ultimately failed in that endeavor. And Alcibiades was one of the critical figures who convinced the Athenians, now that the war had resumed, that they needed to go invade Sicily, across the Aegean back over in Italy. Before the fighting actually began, Alcibiades had to escape. It's a long story. I'm not going to talk about it. So Alcibiades was not on the scene. The person who was on the scene, the person who became the commander of the Athenian forces, was our friend Nicias, who had negotiated the previous peace, but who was nonetheless, once the fighting began, called upon to return to the scene. In 412, he made a terrible, terrible decision, basically based on superstition. And it resulted in the complete rout of the Athenian forces. Their navy was wiped out. Huge amounts of money had been raised to outfit this expedition. Thousands of people were killed or captured. I mean, the young layers, it was like what happened in Britain in World War I, in terms of an entire generation essentially being decapitated. And this really was the beginning of the end for Athens. Unfortunately, the end took another decade, another horrible decade to come to. So 5 years after that happens is when Plato met Socrates, and Socrates became Plato's teacher. One of the first things that Plato would have seen Socrates doing was defending a bunch of Navy captains who had been very successful, but had been forced to leave sailors and ships behind in a terrible, terrible storm. But Athenian law was along the lines of, you got to go down with the ship. And since they didn't, they were put on trial and found guilty and ultimately executed, which means they just cut the head off, the military head off of their own navy. Socrates was one of the people, was among those appointed to manage the trial, was the only one to defend the Navy captains from the standpoint of a real concept of justice, as opposed to some kind of sterile law, which ended up doing nothing except hurt the Athenians themselves. A year later, Alcibiades, who had returned to lead Athenian forces, he was also assassinated. And that was the same year that Athens was defeated. So Plato was 23 years old when you saw the defeat of Athens, now by the Spartans. Now, Plato had come from a very political family. His mother was political, from a political family. His uncle and second cousin, Critias and Parmenides, or maybe it's the other way around, I can never keep it straight, but very, very close relations of Plato, were among the 30 people appointed by the Spartans to become the tyrants and rule Athens, essentially, on behalf of the victorious parties. So again, Plato is 23 years old, and he's seeing members of his family now become part of the 30 tyrants. They didn't last long. Within not much more than a year, they were overthrown by the Democratic Party of Athens, and both Critias and Parmenides were executed. That same Democratic Party of Athens then put Socrates' teacher on trial and found him guilty. And as we all know, he was executed in 399. So Plato was 28 years old when he saw the execution of Socrates. So Mike, you can take that down for the moment, but we might bring it back. I want to do two things tonight. Next week, we'll dive into some of Plato's dialogues and try and delve a little bit more deeply into some of the scientific and philosophical questions. Tonight, I want to do two things primarily. I want to go through the drama of Plato's dialogues, because this history that I just showed you, the dialogues are set at critical moments in this unfolding tragedy of Athens. And Plato is writing them and staging them so that we can examine what went wrong with the thinking of this great culture, that they could make so many tragic mistakes and end up being destroyed in such a way. The second thing I want to go through then is, after the death of Socrates, the battles, what Plato did with the rest of his life, the battles that he and the forces he pulled around him in the Academy waged to try and free Greece and much of the rest of the Mediterranean from this Persian imperial control and manipulation. So let's start with the dialogues, and let's start with the first dialogue, the dialogue which Plato sets the earliest. Of course, he didn't write them in this order, but this is the order that he set them in. The dialogue which is set the earliest is Plato's famous Parmenides Dialogue. Now, this is set in 450 BC. So this is about 18 years before the Peloponnesian War starts. But it's in the period of time when Athens is shifting toward becoming an empire. And of course, Plato knows this history. Now, the questions which have to be, that are being grappled with in all of Plato's dialogues, and frankly, almost all of philosophy, it addresses some very fundamental issues about ontological issues about the nature of reality, epistemological issues about how we know things. And some of these fundamentals are, number one, are there universal principles? Or is the universe just random and chaotic? If there are universal principles, can we know them? And how do we know them? And what is the nature of this universe and the principles which are embedded in it? Now, on that third point, I'm going to devote more of next week's discussion to that third point. But it's especially in the first 2 points. Are there universal principles? And can and how we know them? Which really is, in a sense, the foundation of everything which Plato examines. Now, again, this first dialogue, the Parmenides Dialogue, is about a philosopher from what is known as the Eleatic school. Iliad was just a place in Italy where the founder of this school basically set up. Parmenides was the most famous Eleatic philosopher probably in Greece at the time. And this dialogue is a discussion between Plato and Parmenides. Plato and Parmenides, or rather, I'm sorry, Socrates and Parmenides. Now, I want to mention one other thing about the timing of this 450, because it's around this same period of time that Aeschylus, the great Greek classical poet, is writing his dramas, including Prometheus Bound. And what is really fundamental in terms of addressing these questions is ultimately the issue of the nature of man, which Aeschylus, in a very brilliant way in Prometheus Bound, makes clear that you have two contending images of man. And for those of you who are familiar with Lyndon LaRouche's work, you know that this is also foundational to the way that he looks at the unfolding of history. That is, you have one image of man where man is an animal. We're a creature of our senses, no different than our dogs. We can be ruled over by our betters, whether they're the gods of Olympus or whether they're an imperial elite. We can be manipulated, we can be culled. That's one image of man. And in Prometheus Bound, that's the image which is embodied in the gods on Mount Olympus, but especially Zeus, who wanted to wipe out mankind because we were making too much noise on Earth. The other image of man is embodied by the figure of Prometheus in Prometheus Bound, is man as a creator, man who can discover the powers of his mind to understand the universe, act on the universe, and frankly, improve the universe. And this is why Prometheus is punished by Zeus, because he gives these qualities, not just fire, but he gives these qualities to man. This is the fight in civilization. This is what Mr. LaRouche was referring to in those previous quotes. Now, the Parmenides Dialogue is the paradoxes, the problems that you run into in this dialogue and in other dialogues derive from the problem of, if you can't know the universals, where does that leave you? Now, what the Eleatics argued is that, yes, there was a universal. I mean, they weren't complete crazy anarchists who said the universe is chaos. They said, yes, there is a universal. The universal is the one. It is unchanging, unmoving, all-encompassing. It does not participate in any way with the quality of manyness or particulars or things which change, which is what we experience in our physical bodies in the physical universe. The one doesn't participate that in any way. Well, that leaves us with a problem if you think that man only knows the universe through his senses. You can't know the one. There's no way you're going to know it. And that was essentially where Parmenides ends up, that there is a one, there is a universal, but we can't know it. Maybe we can know it through some kind of mystical experience. I guess in the 20th century, that took the form of an LSD trip, but you can't know universals. You can't know the one. This opens the door to all sorts of bad philosophy and bad statecraft over the course of the next 2,000 years. This opens the door to the existentialists like Nietzsche. Nietzsche, the Frankfurt School of Theodor Adorno, they loved the Eleatics because that gave them their pass. If we can't know universals, you got pretty much a free rein to do whatever you want. You know, might makes right, or custom is what rules the world. because there can be no dialogue among peoples to discover these universals so that we can apply them to our world. Now, what Plato does in the Parmenides Dialogue, and this is a very rigorous, serious philosophical discussion. I mean, some of Plato's dialogues get pretty raucous, some verge on violence and so on, but he's taking this very seriously because this is essentially the foundational problem that they're going to deal with. It's a difficult dialogue to read in large part because most of the translations do not do justice to the concepts and ideas that Plato is playing with. But all sorts of paradoxes arise, and this is what Socrates just drives home, the paradoxes. The fact that this philosophy just leads you into all sorts of dead ends and, corners. There's only one point in this dialogue where Socrates opens the window to a solution to all of these paradoxes in a way where you can look at the world where you might be able to get something done. I'm going to come back to that moment a little bit later. So that in a sense, but this question of removing knowledge of the universals from man's activity is really the beginning of the end. Now, there's a natural devolution from that. The consequence of that is to operate from the standpoint that there are no universals. And this is what takes you to the plague of sophistry in Athens. And this is what Socrates was in battle with. This is what Plato was in battle with. The Sophists were people whose main and often lucrative occupation was just teaching people methods of speech, methods of rhetoric, ways of convincing people, just how, sort of like big tech today. Forget about any principles, forget about any search for the truth. The question is, how can you just manipulate people to get, whatever your political intentions were done? And I mean, this is what we're facing today with the cancel culture. This is what we're facing today with the tyranny of the narrative of popular opinion and popular culture. This is the language of today's Democratic Party and the Biden collective. It's not surprising because it was the language of the Athenian Democratic Party that executed Socrates. So many, many, many of Plato's dialogues are populated with sophists and what I call the victims of the sophists, people who sought to do the right thing for Athens, but because they were infected with this kind of populist philosophy, you can't even call it a philosophy, they became prey to being manipulated. Like, for example, Nicias, when he made his tragic mistake that led to the destruction of Sicily. Now, Mike, can you put that last slide up, the timeline again, one more time? Because again, I want people to just be very clear in terms of locating how political these dialogues are. So look at, again, 432, when the Peloponnesian War begins. Plato set no less than 3 dialogues in 432. One of them, the Protagoras, is about one of the most famous sophists. It takes place in the home of one of the more influential people in Athens. Protagoras, who's a sophist, is there. Another guy, Prodicus, another sophist, is there. Some of the leading figures who are going to participate in the tragedy of Athens are there in watching this, like Critias, Plato's relative, and the unfortunate Alcibiades. So that's one of the dialogues set in 432. There's an Alcibiades dialogue, which is about Plato's efforts when Alcibiades was young in trying to shape his way of thinking so that he would not become a tragic figure. The third dialogue set in 432 is called Charmides. This is Plato's other relative who ends up becoming a member of the 30 tyrants and getting executed. So you can see what Plato has done. He goes back to the beginning. He goes back to how people's minds were infected such that they would ultimately make these tragic decisions, which led to the collapse of Athens. Most of Plato's dialogues can be located in time. Some of them can't, but most can. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but it's just fascinating to see how he locates this unfolding tragedy. I do want to just mention two other, though, dialogues in terms of this kind of setting. One is in 416. This is when the peace of Nicias collapsed and led to the final demise of Athens. That's when Plato sets the Symposium dialogue. And again, the cast of characters is famous poets, philosophers. Alcibiades shows up again. And this is actually a discussion about the nature of love. And then the other dialogue I want to mention, just in terms of its setting, is towards the end. It's the Meno Dialogue. And many of you have heard us discuss the Meno Dialogue. This is this amazing, amazing dialogue where Plato, or Socrates, takes a slave boy and causes him through a process of dialectic dialogue to discover for himself how to discover, to double the square. Now, again, the people in this dialogue, besides Socrates and the slave boy, it's very ominous. It's named for Meno. It's because it's in the household of Meno. He was a member of the Democratic Party of Athens, and he was essentially a Persian agent. And then the other figure who shows up toward the end is Anytus, and he is one of the people who indicts Socrates, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, and ensures that Socrates is executed a couple of years later. So you really can't read the Meno Dialogue simply as an intellectual exercise. It's a very powerful intellectual exercise. But again, it's embedded in this very, very intense political fight. Now, I want to briefly go from the death of Socrates and give you something of a description of the incredibly political nature of Plato and his Academy. Again, the overarching dynamic is the fact that the Persian Empire is manipulating and controlling many forces throughout Greece, throughout the Turkish coast, which is called Ionia. The Persians are actually in control of Egypt at this point. So when Socrates is executed, the first thing Plato does is he gets out of Dodge. He and a lot of people leave Athens, and he begins to travel for a good 17 or 18 years, first in Greece, probably also to Egypt. I believe he did that, but it's the kind of thing you don't have hard proof of. And then certainly extensive time in Sicily, in Syracuse. In fact, he took 3 trips to Sicily, which I'll come back to in a minute. But his first trip wasn't working out so well. He was actually captured, and it was threatened to be sold into slavery. There were various political moves that freed him. But in the meantime, his friends had raised money to ransom him if that was needed. It turned out the money wasn't needed, but that ransom money is what Plato used when he went back and he founded the Academy in 387 BC. Now, as I was thinking about this earlier, again, I've got to, bee in my bonnet over the idea that the Academy was academic. Suddenly it occurred to me, it's really much more like the West Point Academy, because the Academy was not only a place where philosophers, mathematicians, scientists, and so on gathered to grapple with these fundamental questions of the nature of the universe and the nature of man, studying geometry, making scientific breakthroughs. One of the assignments that Plato gave to all the attendees was to try and come up with an accurate model of the heavens, which took into account all the motions of the heavenly bodies. In other words, what Kepler dealt with many centuries later was already being studied at Plato's Academy. And I think there's a very strong argument that they did understand that the sun was at the center, not the earth. But again, these are things you can only infer at this point. But the Academy, as I say, was also like West Point. Because what Plato did throughout the first part of this century, from the death of Socrates in 399 to Plato's own death in 347, is he tried to pull together the forces throughout Greece, throughout Ionia, in Egypt, and over in Italy, in Sicily, where the Persian influenced city-states could be defeated. Now, again, the Persians were not sitting on top of Greece, but they were running many of the city-states. They were influencing many of the leaders of many of these city-states. So it was a very fluid kind of situation. It's not like there were good guys and bad guys. The Athenians were the good guys and the Spartans were the bad guys. There were good and bad people in Athens and in Sparta. Some city-states were more under the control of the Persians, and others were more in the resistance mode. But what Plato did is work with whatever forces he could, again, to bring together these combinations to confront those Persian-controlled areas. And these were serious fights. Theaetetus, the great geometer, for whom the Theaetetus Dialogue is named, and who played a critical role in developing the Platonic solids, he died as a result of being wounded in one of these military battles. And the Theaetetus Dialogue begins with him being carried back to Athens, mortally wounded. And then the rest of the dialogue is a reminiscence by Socrates of how he first met the brilliant young geometer, Theaetetus. Socrates took 3 trips to Italy because I think he recognized, rather Plato took 3 trips to Italy. I think he recognized, sort of as Nicholas of Cusa and Columbus did, that the oligarchy was so much in control of Europe, you had to go west if you were going to found anything new. I think Plato had that same conception, because Sicily was not under the control of the Persians. It was different Greek factions. And his idea was to try and create a philosopher king. He came very close with one of his collaborators, Dion, became the head of Syracuse for a while before he was actually executed. At one point, Plato had tried to convince an earlier Sicilian ruler to attack the temple of Delphi and try and shut it down. He couldn't convince that guy to do it, but 20 years later, some of Plato's allies did conquer the Oracle of Delphi for a brief period of time. The Oracle of Delphi was like big tech. They're the ones who told you what to think. That's how the Persians manipulated you if you didn't have your own commitment to discover the truth and act on truthful principles. But for all of this, I mean, there were some victories, but mostly they were setbacks. And by the time that Plato died in 347, the Persians were still pretty much running the show in many parts of the Mediterranean and then going eastward into their empire, until a person who had been a student of a member of Plato's Academy emerged. And Mike, if you can put the next slide up. This is Alexander the Great. Now, one of the biggest lies in history is that he was Aristotle's pupil. He was not. And in fact, there's no contemporary, or even in the first 200 years after Alexander's life, nobody claimed he was Aristotle's pupil. That comes in later. Aristotle was in the court with his father, but Alexander was not his pupil. He was a pupil of Plato's Academy. And you can see what he did from 334. Now remember, Plato has died in 347, but from 34 to 323, in just 11 years, he conquered the Persian Empire with and began to build cities, began to make the potential of Plato's conceptions of how you would govern a city. It laid the possibility for this to begin to happen. But unfortunately, his life was cut short. He was poisoned by an associate of Aristotle. He had previously almost been poisoned by Aristotle's nephew, but he caught Aristotle's nephew and executed him. But ultimately, he was poisoned. The immediate political potential for Plato's ideas to come to pass had to wait for a very long time. In fact, they had to wait for the American Revolution to finally come to pass. But the ideas were kept alive through St. Paul, through Kepler, through Leibniz, through others. The battle against the Aristotelians is what has defined, frankly, the fight for ideas for the past 2,000 years. And I'm not going to try and go into Aristotle's philosophy, except to simply say it is the Zeus side of the equation. You're pretty much not much more than an animal because you really can only know the world through your senses. Now, what we have to do is we have to revive Plato's method. We have to revive the quality of discovery, of commitment to unfolding the principles of the universe and making that the basis for governing our societies, not popular opinion, not some kind of custom, not some kind of dictatorship, but rather this unending search to participate in the unfolding creative universe that we live in. And we're not going to get back there until, we're not going to succeed until we return to Plato's method and consciously reject everything which is in the tradition of the Aristotelians. Now, I want to conclude by giving you a little bit of an appetizer, because a lot of what I've discussed tonight has been the history, has been the political fights and so on. And I've touched on some of the important philosophical questions, but I want to give you a kind of appetizer in terms of Plato's methods. I want to go through briefly one section of Plato's 7th letter. Now, this is a little heretical because everybody wants to talk about the dialogues. Frankly, one of my favorite parts of Plato is this little section of Plato's 7th letter, where he's addressing the fact that one of the failed leaders of Italy, Dionysius II, who actually executed Plato's friend Dion, is running around claiming that he's a student of Plato's. And it's true, Plato had tried to teach him, just didn't succeed, like with Alcibiades. And Dionysius has said he's written a book about Plato's thinking. And Plato says, well, that's odd, because I've never written a book about my thinking, because you can't write it down. And what he does in this delightful little section of the 7th letter is he puts you through the kind of mental, spiritual exercise that leads to concept formation, that leads to truly human thinking. And I just want to go through this with you because I just love it. What Plato says is that for everything that exists, whether it's a concept like justice or an image like a circle, there are 5 elements to it. There are 3 parts of it by which you then gain the knowledge of it. And the 4th is the existence itself. Justice exists in the universe. Your knowledge of it is different than from the fact that it exists. A concept of the circle exists in the universe. So what I want to go through right now is just how Plato unfolds this process of developing an idea. So he uses the circle as the example. And he says, well, the first thing we have is the name. A circle is a thing spoken of, and its name is the very word which we just uttered, circle. And he makes the point that's perfectly arbitrary. You could have given it any other name, but you've given it that name. The second is then its definition, which is made up of names and verbal forms. And he says, we have the name round or annular or circle. Will you describe that? It might be defined as that which has the distance from its circumference to its center everywhere equal. That's the geometrical definition of a circle. So that's the definition. The third, he says, is that comes that which is drawn or rubbed out again. In other words, you can draw a circle, and then you can rub it out, or you can make one on a lathe. So that's an image or a physical object. And then the fourth, if I can't see it on my screen, I don't know, Mike, if you can scroll down a little bit. Maybe.
I can't scroll down because it's a slide.
Yeah, okay.
You want me, I can see it. You want me to read it?
Yeah, could you?
It says, fourth comes knowledge, intelligence, and right opinion about these things. And it says, and these we must assume to form a single whole, which does not exist in vocal utterances or in bodily forms, but in souls.
That's my favorite part. This knowledge of these aspects of the circle, it exists in your soul, not in bodily forms. But these are all just the springboard to the fifth. So if you can go to the next one. And in the first paragraph, he's just saying, look, this can apply to circles, to objects, to the characters in souls, to many such things. But you cannot really acquire the knowledge of the fifth, the essence of the thing, unless you've grasped these other four. And then again, you're probably going to have to pick up and read because it's not going to fit on the screen. But then he goes through this. This is one of my favorite parts. He says, after much effort, as names, which we discussed, definitions, sights, and other data of sense are brought into contact and friction with each other in the course of scrutiny and kindly testing by men who proceed by question and answer without ill will, with a sudden flash, there shines forth understanding about every problem and an intelligence whose efforts reach the furthest limits. Pick it up, Mike.
The furthest limits of human powers. End
yes. And then go to the final one. So he brings it back again to this question that you're not going to write down his philosophy. It's not a cookbook. It's not a recipe. He says, there does not exist, nor will there ever exist, any treatise of mine dealing therewith, for it does not at all admit of verbal expression like other studies, but as a result of continued application to the subject itself and communion therewith, it is brought to birth in the soul on a sudden, as a light that is kindled by a leaping spark, and thereafter nourishes it itself. And then he comes back to the hapless Dionysius one more time. And he says, for the writings of Dionysius were not meant as aids to memory. Since there is no fear lest anyone should forget the truth of it, once he has grasped it with his soul, seeing that it occupies the smallest possible space. This is such a beautiful, again, spiritual exercise in discovery, but also embedded in this is the idea of a singularity on the sudden. You know, when you get an idea, it doesn't take place in time or space. It is on a sudden. And I mentioned earlier that there was a point in the Parmenides where Socrates does give you a window into a way out of Parmenides' world. And it is exactly the same word that he uses here, on a sudden, or the suddenly. The idea of something which happens in the mind and frankly, these kinds of singularities also happen in the universe, which are really outside of space and time. And then in that final comment where he says, once you get one of these, it's in your soul and it occupies the smallest possible space. And I can't help but think of this as a precursor to Leibniz's conception of the infinitesimal. So what this to me is, is a seed crystal of Plato. This process, which we've just compressed into a few minutes, this is what he unfolds in each one of these dialogues. The friction, the back and forth, the contradictions between different aspects of reality. And he does this because he has a passion to rescue civilization from the evils that he has seen befall Greece and the other city-states. And I just want to conclude the discussion tonight by drawing that out. Because for Plato, as for Lyndon LaRouche, it's never a question of treatises or recipes or policies. And in fact, most of the misinterpretations of Plato come from people who read stuff and want to take it literally. It's as if they're reading Dionysius's, a description which is not truthful of the process which Plato is trying to put your mind through. But for Plato and for LaRouche, the question really is, what are the principles which will, if you will, keep us up with a creative, self-developing universe so that we can continue to participate in that creative, self-developing universe, a universe which is constantly developing the kinds of singularities that on the sudden actually represents. And this is the issue of the difference between a republic and a democracy. The Republican Party with a small r, and the Democratic Party with a small d, which today also is the Democratic Party with the big D. The Democratic Party throws out the window this search for the truth, this question of universal principles. The Republican Party and a republic must be grounded in that, which is why every great Republican thinker, from Plato through Leibniz to Benjamin Franklin, was also a scientist. And that's some of the things that we'll touch on next week when we look at the Republic, when we look at the Timaeus, and perhaps look at some of Plato's other dialogues in terms of more of an exploration of this really always very playful method of concept formation that he went through in that wonderful section of the seventh letter. So I hope this helps you start on a journey with Plato, in which you will have many happy singularities and bursts of light. So I'll conclude today with that and open it up for discussion.